Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. So if everybody can find their seat. I think we're okay now? Great. Can anybody hear me? Yes? Great. Okay, so welcome. I want to welcome all of you to our community forum on citizen engagement in the 2018 election. Thank you for taking the time on what I know was a pretty rainy day to come out tonight. My name is Larissa Wall, and I'm the Tzedek Program Manager. Tzedek means justice, here at B'nai Jeshurun. And this evening's forum is the last in a series of programs and events this June of Faith in Public Life, our year-long initiative. Over the course of this year, we have engaged the BJ community through study, conversation, and action, and explored the relationship between religion and democracy, considering what Jewish wisdom, experience, and practice has to offer our efforts to repair the torn social fabric of today's America. Tonight's forum is an important part of our work, deeply rooted in the understanding that to change the narrative, we must engage in our democracy and its current political processes. We have the opportunity to make our voices heard by supporting candidates who represent our values and encouraging others to participate. I hope that each and every one of you leaves this sanctuary tonight energized by what is possible and with a renewed dedication to engagement. I'd just like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors, the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan's Joseph Stern Center for Social Responsibility, the Church of St. Paul and St. Andrew, the Fourth Universalist Society, Reformed Jewish Voice of New York State, which represents over 100 congregations throughout New York State, Congregation Rodef Shalom, and Citizen American Voter at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. I'd also like to mention very briefly that it is membership season here at the synagogue at B'nai Jeshurun. If you are curious about our community, if you are a member and have not yet renewed, we have Jamalia and Lucretia in the back at our membership table who can share more information with you, and we'd be happy to help you register and renew if that is what you need to do. And we also have Sandra Abramson, who is here with Jews for Racial and Economic Justice in the back, who has information on how to get engaged with the caring majority and canvassing in the Bronx. So if you have any interest in doing that, please see her after the program. So, and now I would like to introduce our moderator for the evening. Ester Fuchs is Professor of International and Public Affairs and Political Science and Director of the Urban and Social Policy Program at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. She previously chaired Urban Studies for Barnard and Columbia Colleges. Fuchs serves as Director of who'sontheballot.org, an online voter engagement initiative. Fuchs is also a member of the Faculty Steering Committee of the Eric Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights and the Provost Just Society's Task Force. She recently received the Bella Abzug Leadership Award, the City and State Above and Beyond Exceptional New York Women Award for Education, and an award for outstanding teaching at SEPA. And she is going to introduce our panel for tonight.
I think I'm going to sit, if nobody minds, because there's no podium, and I'll pretend we're a seminar, and that way you'll all know to be ready, because I might call on you. All right. I'm really delighted to be here this evening. Mic closer, okay. Usually I project extremely well. But I am, as I said, delighted to be here this evening at BJ, and I too want to thank all those sponsors, because it's exciting to be involved in anything where people are actually cooperating with each other and institutions are actually cooperating. And I especially want to thank my good friend Joyce Miller, without whom this event would not have happened. So I thought I would start with a little bit of data before I introduce our panelists, and I will bring them up very shortly, because I know this is an audience that's interested in the facts, and sometimes the facts are very hard to come by in our political discourse. Everybody knows that elections and voting are the primary way Americans, wherever they live, whether it's cities, suburbs, or the rural parts of our country, it's the way we define democracy, which is why voting is so important. And sometimes we forget that because all of us are engaged in a variety of forms of political action, whether it's voluntary organizations, whether it's working on the causes that we care about through a direct service. But in fact, without being engaged in this action, this simple action of voting, we lose an enormous opportunity to influence the most important decisions that are being made about our country. And I think it's all the more apparent now and today. And I have a feeling there's so many people here today, not just because they want to hear the wonderful Congressman Nadler, but also because there's a great deal of frustration, concern, trepidation, and probably even a whole lot of anger. And so maybe I'm going to make you a little bit more angry before we start working on real solutions. Let me tell you about some of just very quickly, the voter turnout figures in this country, because all they're doing is going down, okay? In the 2008 presidential election, we had a 63.5% voter turnout. Our mayor's race, 28.2%. That's really kind of extraordinary. I almost can't even say it out loud. And even if election is non-competitive, don't even bother looking at the primaries, which are even lower than the general elections. We just had a primary. For some people, it was an extremely competitive primary in the race out in Queens that defeated Crowley. Anybody know what the turnout was? I knew you knew. 10%. 10%. 10%. I had to read it 3 times. Oh, the last gubernatorial race, 33.5%. Judicial races, they get a big 5%. Sometimes they're not competitive at all. I sort of don't blame us for not voting in those. The 2012 presidential race, 58%. 2013 mayor's race, 24%. So the trend is down, the trend is not good, and so part of this evening will be really our discussion about citizen engagement and what the 2018 election means. It's not enough to talk about voting. It's not enough even to be engaged in your most favorite causes for political action. We really all now have to be part of the solution of getting people out to vote. And many of us understand that there were multiple reasons why we had the outcome in the last presidential election. But one of the really unfortunate reasons we had the last outcome in that election was so many of the people who might have voted for Hillary Clinton did not vote or did not even register to vote. So I'm not talking about undocumented non-citizens. I'm talking about people who could be voting who don't vote. And so this to me is really the challenge of our time now, to re-engage especially young people in the democratic process. And I mean the democratic process, small d. And I can't think of 2 people who I would rather be having this conversation with this evening, not to mention everybody else in this room. And I'm going to introduce them to us. I mean, I don't know, they really don't need an introduction, but I'll do it anyway. I'm going to introduce them because, you know what, people deserve an introduction, right? So first, Congressman Jerry Nadler. All right. Thank you, thank you. Thank you for coming. I think Congressman Nadler, I think really one of the most important things I can tell you about him is I don't know anybody that works harder in Congress, not just for this district, because he's our congressman, but for the things that make our country great, the things that truly make our country great, civil rights and civil liberties. And he is the champion, always there. He is the champion, always there in that struggle for civil rights and civil liberties, and now for voting rights. You know, he was in the New York State Assembly where he started in 1976 working on these very same issues, and he took his energy and his wisdom, his principles, and his goodwill and his humor, and his amazing stories. He took them to Congress with him, and he forged partnerships. And one of the great things about Jerry is that he works with everyone, and they all respect him. And we are all the more fortunate to have him represent us. And I think this is truly a passion for him. And so this evening we're really, I think, in for a treat to have Congressman Nadler, who is now the ranking member on Judiciary, and I think all of us want to change him to chair for the fall. We all want to do that, to be here with us this evening. And it's also my great pleasure to introduce Wendy Weiser. Please come up, Wendy. And I know a lot of people here know Wendy. She is the director of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, which most of you know is a nonpartisan think tank and a public interest law center. And she started and runs the Voting Rights Project at the Brennan Center. She has written an enormous number of law review articles, but what she also does is engage in the public discourse. So you can see her as a commentator, you can read her opinion pieces. As an academic, I feel strongly that people like Wendy are the best gift to ensuring that facts will ultimately prevail in our political discourse. She's the type of person who gets out there, is not afraid, and does the work of informing the public. And it is work, and she does it. And I'm so glad you could join us today. Wendy, not only is she an educator, she is a litigator, and she continues to do litigation. And she received her BA from Yale and her JD from Yale Law School, where I think they train people very well for this kind of work, is what I've been told. So welcome, Wendy and Congressman Nadler. So I think that's appropriate, I do. So we have a lot we want to cover this evening, and we also want to engage all of you in a conversation as well. And we don't want to depress you too much, because I know people are here because they actually want to do something, and they want to see the solutions down the road. But I actually thought that it was very important that we begin our conversation with some facts and get some of the important issues on the table so that we start from the same place in our discussion. So I really want to start with Congressman Nadler. I think this is a very important question I'm about to ask him, and it's a big question. And I know, you can speak at length about anything. But this is actually really important. Part of the reason that we worry about elections is not because, it's so important just to vote in elections. Elections actually have a very strong relationship to public policy. And the legislature really has an important role in public policy. And I find that with my students, we often forget about that. We look at elections sort of in a little vacuum and forget that it makes a difference who is elected in Washington to the legislature. So Jerry, really, I would like you to talk to us a little bit about what's happened in Washington since Trump became president, since we've had a Republican majority in the House and Senate, for some of the national domestic, we're going to stay with domestic for the moment because it would be too much to cover everything, but the domestic policy issues that many of us care about, whether it's budget priorities, tax policy, healthcare, and even infrastructure, which is a big area that Jerry knows a lot about besides everything else.
Well, first of all, thank you for that great unpaid campaign ad. Second, is this going on? Okay.
Pull it in close.
Second, voting does matter. The big difference since Trump came into office, obviously, is that you don't have a president who's going to check the Republican. Is that you don't have a president.
I think the other one needs to be turned off, maybe.
Is that you don't have a president who's going to check the Congress. You have a president who first of all, doesn't pay attention to a large extent and is ignorant. But the people he's appointed, the head of the Office of Management and Budget, puts together a terrible budget, which is so terrible that we end up fighting with them. We have been lucky enough. We have been lucky enough that there are divisions sufficient in the Republican caucus in the House that they have not, in the last 2 years, been able to get a majority vote just on their side of the aisle, which means they have to turn to Democrats. So they'll offer a budget with 150 poison pills, defund Planned Parenthood, do this, do that, and terrible cuts in all domestic spending, and we'll compromise. We'll get rid of all the poison pills, and we'll have halfway decent budget numbers. That's what's happened the last 2 years. Whether it'll happen again depends on the election results. If they get more Republicans in the House, and they can get their act together so they don't need Democratic votes, then we'll get really terrible results. If we turn the House over, which God willing, it'll be much better. But let me just mention a few things on domestic policy. First of all, the budget. Quietly, well, they do really bad cuts, and we've mitigated the damage on everything you care about: education, housing for low-income people, social services, you name it. Secondly, they are trying across the board to not to means test, but to put work requirements on everything, on food stamps, on Medicaid, things where there are no work requirements now. What's so terrible about work requirements? It means that if you lose your job, and most people getting food stamps work full time, they just don't make enough money to afford food. But if you lose your job, you don't work enough hours for 1 week, the proposal is you lose food stamps for 6 months, for 2 weeks, for 3 years. Ditto for Medicaid, ditto for a lot of other things. We have staved this off so far. So that's the budget. They want to increase the military budget and cut every discretionary amount. Second, a budget obviously consists of two things. It consists of revenue and outgo. The revenue is controlled by taxes. And unfortunately, they passed this huge tax, we call it tax scam, they call it tax cut. And what does it do? It reduces revenue by about $2 trillion over 10 years, which produces a deficit increase of about $1.8 trillion according to the Congressional Budget Office. Well, if you produce that, then they turn around and say, oh my God, we've got to cut entitlements. We've got to cut Social Security, we've got to cut Medicare, and we've got to cut Medicaid. Very difficult politically to cut Medicare and Social Security, but much easier to cut Medicaid, because a lot of voters look at it and say, oh, Medicaid, that's for them. That's for the poor people. Or maybe that's for the black people or the Hispanic people. Not so terrible if we cut it. People, first of all, it is terrible, obviously, but that's the politics of it. People don't realize that although Medicaid started out as a medical program for low-income people, the majority of Medicaid dollars today pays for nursing homes and home health care, essentially for middle-class people. Low-income people too, but middle-class people. We have to educate people for that in order to develop a greater political base to sustain Medicaid spending. But this huge tax cut is being used and will be used as a cudgel. Look at the huge deficits. You produce a huge deficit, and then you use that to justify cuts that otherwise would be more difficult to justify. And without a lot of publicity, all the departments. Now, Pruitt, the head of EPA, Environmental Protection, has gotten a lot of publicity, mostly because he's too stupid to keep his greed and his corruption behind the scenes. But his greed and his corruption are the secondary problem. What he's doing, perfectly legitimately, policy-wise, is a much worse problem. They're cutting every conceivable environmental protection. And people forget, why do we have these environmental protections? I mean, my God, they regulate business. They do terrible things. They make it more expensive to do business. Because otherwise you can't drink the water, you can't breathe the air. But that's where we're going. We're trying to go back to that. Not to mention that instead of promoting clean energy, if you look at the Washington Post today, big article, they're proposing to gut the research budgets for solar and wind energy. They're even cutting the research budget for clean coal. We want coal, we want fossil fuels, but not clean coal. So they want to poison the air, and of course they don't want to do anything about climate change. So these are some of the things, the budget, the tax scam, oh, and of course social policy. They're doing everything they can administratively to make it impossible for people to get abortions. Now, one person whose name I cannot remember, I don't want to remember, is the head of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Until 2 weeks ago, we were screaming at him because he had no background in refugee resettlement or in any population resettlement. He was an anti-abortion activist who they put in charge of refugee resettlement. Why? They needed a job for him. And who cares about refugees anyway? So what did he do with his job? Any pregnant teenager, anyone who is claiming asylum, anybody who has a questionable status who is in custody, is in ORR's custody, and he would prohibit, for his own personal thing, prohibit abortion, make it impossible for them to get an abortion. It's not agency policy. He just made sure it happened. So the ACLU stepped in, and has won a number of court suits when they know about the case. Now, of course, he's graduated to other things. He's in charge of family separation and things like that. Same individual. On civil liberties, obviously, they've been terrible. And Congress, well, we haven't enacted terrible civil liberties bills, but we haven't done anything to restrain a president. When a president assails the press as the enemy of the people, fine old Stalinist phrase, I thought was retired in 1953 with Stalin, assails the press as the enemy of the people, keeps telling people don't believe anything, fake news, assails the judiciary, puts pressure, you have to respond and you have to protect these institutions. We depend for our liberties on a free press, an independent judiciary. And aside from the fact that they're trying to pack the courts with right-wing ideologues, all pre-selected by the Federalist Society, they're assailing it. They are administratively and legislatively sabotaging the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. They're deliberately making it more expensive for people to get health care. Deliberately, there's a certain amount of money in the budget, for instance. You have to sign up. There's a renewal period for Obamacare for health care every year. And the federal government contracts with private organizations to advertise it and to sign people up. The amount of money appropriated for that was cut in half, and they haven't distributed it. So all these organizations are waiting to see how much money they get or if they get money. And they cut down the enrollment period in half. So they're doing everything they can to make sure that fewer people sign up for it. They repealed in the tax bill, they repealed the individual mandate. And then they have the nerve to go into the Supreme Court and say, oh, if the individual mandate is repealed, of necessity, the requirement in the Affordable Care Act that you cover pre-existing conditions, that has to fall too. It's a dishonest legal argument, which I won't go into why it's dishonest now, but they're all in favor, they say, of people not having to worry about pre-existing conditions. You can still get insurance without discrimination, which is what Obamacare does for the first time. But then they go into court and they say, you got to get rid of this because we made it unconstitutional by passing this provision, which we never said anything about having this impact. And, of course, is the general erosion of civil rights and civil liberties. We have done nothing. The administration, the various states especially, have been doing, and I'm sure Wendy will speak more about this, in a million different ways, cutting down on voting rights, gerrymandering, voter suppression, and Congress has done nothing. We could do things, but we have done nothing about any of this. We won't hold hearings about it. We won't deal with it. We won't deal with the fact we ought to be holding here. Part of Congress's power, great part of Congress' power, someone called Congress the Great Inquisitor, not to be compared with the Great Inquisition, but the Great Inquisitor, meaning that we have the power of oversight, and it has to be used. We have held no oversight hearings except about Hillary's emails. That we're holding oversight hearings about. That's a pressing crisis at the moment. But over everything else, whether it's the families being separated at the border or anything else, or the president's, for the first time, as far as I can tell in American history, having major private holdings, not divesting from him, and in effect violating the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, which is a clause designed to make sure that the president isn't in the pay of some foreign power, not officially on the payroll, but doing favors back and forth, which may very well be the case. It may very well be the case that when Trump organization gets a number of copyrights from the Chinese government, and suddenly you see that they say ZTE company is okay. Maybe there's a connection, and maybe not. We ought to be investigating this. We ought to be investigating the president's violations of the Emoluments Clause and all of this. We're not doing that. So we have to have a Congress that will hold the administration, any administration, but especially this one, because they recognize no limits whatsoever, in check, and that will protect civil liberties, and that will do decent things with the budget and the legislative power. I must say, Congress has passed major legislation, of which I'm very proud of being one of the authors, in things that are important: music licensing, some copyright laws, trade secret protections. Very nice, but that's about it.
Thank you, Congressman Nadler. I don't think this is on. Okay, I think we're going to pass this mic. I think you've made it clear to us that it actually makes a difference who's elected. This has always been a sore point in classes that I've taught when people say, oh, it doesn't matter, it's Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Well, you know what? It's pretty clear it matters, and it matters to the priorities that I'm sure everybody in this room cares about. And so if we've established that it matters, then I want to ask my next question to Wendy about her work at the Brennan Center, because she has been in the forefront in fighting the Republican Party's efforts to make it more difficult for people in our country to vote. Very simply, to make it more difficult to vote. And I know you're all familiar with the word now. Voter suppression is part of our vocabulary. Who knew what voter suppression was in a democratic society? It's something we saved for authoritarian regimes, but now we talk about voter suppression in the United States. So, Wendy, could you tell us a little bit about the recent history of this and explain how the attack on voting rights began and what kinds of laws have been passed to suppress voter turnout, and a little bit about the impact? So I'm asking everybody very simple questions because I know that.
Does this one work?
They can
I think
answer.
I have a working microphone. Is this correct?
Yes.
Well, thank
Yours
you.
is working.
So I'll start with the elections having consequences, as we've all painfully learned how many consequences. And one of those consequences was not supposed to be in a democratic system, then the victors changing the rules and rigging the system so that they cannot be held accountable or so that power cannot change. And that is one, we're hearing also a lot about the norms of democracy being flouted, and we're not respecting the basic norms of behavior. And one of the first norms to go was that, the norm that you're supposed to play by the ground rules and not change the rules once you get in power so that you can stay in power. But unfortunately, that has been what's been going on. And I'll start, I'd say the modern vote suppression effort probably dates back to the 2000 election, which many folks painfully remember, where people looked under the hood, looking at the Florida voting problems, and realized that minor manipulations in the rules for how election administration work can have serious consequences for the outcomes of elections. And that became a strategy. And we started to see over that decade in a number of places popping up efforts to change the rules of the game to get to strategically make it harder for certain voters to participate. That exploded after the 2010 election. So in 2010, Republicans swept state houses across the country and immediately began a fairly widespread program of passing laws that make it harder for eligible citizens to vote. You've all probably heard a lot about these strict voter ID laws, and that was certainly one of the centerpieces of the effort. It wasn't the only part of the effort. There have been laws that are cutting back on voter registration access, laws that cut back on early voting participation in days, laws that make it harder for people with past criminal convictions to participate, laws that require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote, laws requiring you to sign a particular way, an affidavit ballot for it to be counted, or if you don't meet this technical requirement. It's just a range of very creative ways that strategically make it harder to vote. They apply to everybody, but they don't impact everyone equally. And they all have somewhat similar impacts, disproportionately keeping away people of color, people with low incomes, students, older voters, and people who with disabilities. And we saw this happen in great numbers after the 2000 election. So I want to fast forward to today and tell you a little bit of where we're at. But before I do that, I want to say that that wasn't the only big wave that started in 2010. The other thing that happened in those state houses is, as you may recall, that every 10 years we conduct a national census. And after that, we reapportion our seats in Congress, and every state also redistricts based on the numbers to get fair, equal districts across and to reflect population changes. And so 2010, with these new majorities, instead of redistricting, that opportunity was taken to usher in an era of extreme gerrymanders all across the country. And we've studied this, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but this has, in the current Congress, the extreme Republican gerrymanders account for roughly 16 to 17 seat advantage. We've also studied some of the impact that it might have in the upcoming election and find that nationally to take, if the Democrats were to win the House of Representatives, it will take more than 10% vote swing in order to be able, which is historically way out of proportion for normal vote swings, even in wave election years, for that to happen because of this extreme gerrymandering. And the gerrymandering is not just a Republican problem. Democrats do it too and have done it too, but what has happened in the last decade was much more extreme and widespread than we've seen before, and as we get to that, it's going to get worse. So I'm going to fast forward to today and where we're at on the voting and redistricting issue. Right now, going into the 2018 elections, 23 states have laws on the book that make it harder to vote than they did in 2010. That is 8 more than did, or there are 8 states that passed laws since 2016. So the numbers are continuing to increase. And these, in addition, and it's not just new laws, we're also seeing other policies. You've heard about these new aggressive purges where the voter rolls, I mean, there was a massive problem in Brooklyn, actually, as well. But there are more, as we get to the Supreme Court cases, you'll hear some of the policies that are being put in place that knock out voters in large numbers. And this is still going on. These are legislative efforts that are going on across the country this year, and we tracked this legislation. 24 states had bills that they were considering to restrict access to the ballot. 3 of them are likely to be put into law fairly shortly. And we are now, this is going into the 2018 election where we stand. We know now that these laws actually impact participation. There's a growing body of social science research that's showing that. The magnitude varies, but there are millions of people who could be affected, and it could impact turnout. There were some studies, the Government Accountability Office studied voter ID, the impact of voter ID laws in 2 states, in Kansas and Tennessee, in a non-remarkable election. It was a very high impact, and found a 2 to 3% turnout drop in places that have more competitive elections or more diverse electorates. That could be even greater. We've seen an accumulation of research that we can really see an impact on who participates from these laws going on, and so they really can have a big impact in this election. We are also fighting these laws with fewer tools available to us. So as you might have heard, back in 2013, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in a case called Shelby County versus Holder that actually gutted a core provision of the Voting Rights Act that made it a lot harder to put in place changes that make it, that reduce people's access to voting. And in fact, it would block those changes from being put into effect unless a court or the Department of Justice were able to the state could demonstrate to them that they would not have a discriminatory impact or result for minority voters. That has been gutted. That provision is no longer in place, and that provision also stopped discriminatory redistricting plans, and we're actually going into a redistricting cycle for the first time without that provision in place. The courts have still actually been quite the main forum for pushing back against these laws, and many, and if not most, of the court cases have resulted in some kind of victory, where the laws were either blocked or mitigated to some extent. But those court victories are very responsive to the court's perceptions of what the Supreme Court's going to do with those cases as they come up. And so we saw court, in the lead up to 2012, we saw a wave of court victories. We were all very successful. After the 2013 decision in the Shelby County v. Holder, the court decisions started going badly. They've started going well again, and some of that is because the growing accumulation of evidence that these laws are not justified, that they're actually motivated for discriminatory reasons. And I will say that's been a remarkable fact, that many courts have actually found that states and local jurisdictions have purposefully discriminated against minority citizens in their voting laws, and that's really dramatic, because courts aren't usually willing to do that. They'll rule on any other ground and not to say that the state that they're in has been purposefully discriminatory. So I think the courts have been our friends, and the importance of the courts going forward cannot be overstated.
Congressman, I know you have worked on redistricting.
I wanted to
Make 2 points here.
Yeah, the Supreme Court this week came down with the Texas reapportionment case, and some of what they said has led a lot of legal observers to think it's going to be much harder to make redistricting or any other discriminatory cases, because they said that you must give deference to the state legislature. Even when it's quite obvious that the legislative intent is to discriminate, they went back against the lower courts and they said you have to give deference. In other words, it practically puts a requirement to prove bad faith on the plaintiff, which is a very difficult standard. So they destroyed the Section 5 preclearance in Shelby County, and they may, the other day, have started going back on what's left of it to a large extent. The second thing I wanted to say about redistricting, Wendy covered the redistricting very well. I want to make 2 observations. One, technology has made gerrymandering much, much more effective. And it's fantastic. The software is fantastic. You can really get what you want in redistricting these days.
You can
And
rig
secondly,
the system is what you
can
can
rig the
do.
system much more effectively than you could 10 or 20 years ago. Secondly, once you did that in 2010, and the Republicans, they had Project Red Map, in which they caught the Democrats flat-footed, frankly. When you had a lot of these legislatures, they targeted, I think, 19 legislative chambers to flip them. And so they would go into a legislative district with a 20-year incumbent who was used to spending $3,000 for re-election and put in $500,000, literally, and suddenly elected in the right places, 100 and some odd new legislators, flip the legislative seats, and then do the redistricting. And the redistricting is very effective not only in the legislatures but in Congress too, and may very well carry on to the election of the legislatures in 2020, which will do the redistricting next time. So the Democrats are trying the redistricting project in court, but also to elect governors this year to block that and to try to flip legislators. And the last thing I wanted to say about the redistricting is that the Trump administration is very deliberately biasing and sabotaging the census. They are putting in a question without the proper normal pre-testing and pre-certification to ask everybody, are you a citizen? Now imagine, given the atmosphere of terror engendered in minority and immigrant communities by everything that's going on, which they are generating, who's going to answer that question? And the answer is a lot of people, citizens, non-citizens. If you're a citizen, you don't want to answer the census at all because you may have a non-citizen living in the apartment or someone who's undocumented. So you're going to generate, very deliberately I think, millions and millions of people, mostly living in nice big cities like New York, who are not going to be counted in the census, and that's going to rob us of congressional seats and of federal aid, which are given out on a census basis. We're suing on that in court. We'll see how far we get.
The census point is really very important, and I know, Wendy, that you had wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the court cases as well as this issue around the census right now as it relates to redistricting. And I know redistricting doesn't sound like a very sexy topic. And so part of the reason I've asked our panelists to talk to you about it is because so many things that are being done now are really nuts and bolts kinds of issues that change the balance of power in this country. So, we've had a presidential election where the president won with 48% of the vote. That's supposed to happen once in 100 years. Well, remember, it happened with a previous election when Al Gore lost. That's not once in 100 years. That's like once in 15, again later. So there's something fundamentally broken now that it feels like there's an intentionality of my language, my unprofessional, unsocial science language, of rigging the system.
So there's a lot there. I'll say one. I'll start with 2 points. One is on the redistricting, and I know that a lot of folks might be feeling a little despair right now. But
Yeah, everybody.
I'll
Despair.
start with the
Can we think of a
hopeful
better
point.
word?
We're in a very polarized time, and it's not just the legislature. We, the populace, are also very polarized, and studies show that you would rather, like, the worst thing in the world is for your child to tell you they're marrying somebody from the other political party than any other line of difference. I mean, it is. But the one of the issues where we are all really united is on our opposition to and hatred of gerrymandering. And the polls are sort of universally through the roof. People do not like gerrymandering. They do not like legislators choosing their constituents. They don't think it's fair to rig the system. So I feel like that is a potentially winning hand. It is both sort of a constitutional, and actually the Supreme Court has already said this goes against constitutional principles. And what they haven't been able to do is find a standard to settle on when it goes too far. The person who was supposed to agree on that standard just a couple of days ago left right stage, and so we are. That certainly changes things a lot, but we have we're on the right side of the principle, and everybody agrees on this, and so we need to win on this issue. And I will say that there is another case that's heading right back up to the Supreme Court, and I think that the redistricting issue ought to be one of the issues that people talk about in connection with the new justice that is going to be nominated. I think we need to think broadly about the importance of actually maintaining our functioning democracy as a critical thing, a justice that will rein in gerrymandering, that will not expand, that will not prevent the regulation of money in politics, that will believe in the rule of law. So I do think that there's still hope there. The census is something that I think is really important for New Yorkers to get engaged and exercised about. This could have a seriously negative impact on the entire country, but especially on New York. And as Congressman Nadler pointed out, it could impact not just representation here, but federal dollars and the entire shape of the country. And that's something that you can mobilize around to make a difference on, to get people to participate, to ensure people that are protected. Actually, the law does not allow information about the census to be used for purposes like immigration enforcement or law enforcement or really any other purpose. And we need to breathe life into that law and ensure that those protections are there and ensure that people are not afraid and participate, because if they're not counted, we're all going to lose and they're all going to lose. I want to now sort of, that's the happy affirmative on the adding one more danger. What the next shoe to drop on this train of efforts to entrench power and shift political power will follow on this citizenship question. And the effort is going to be an effort to try to exclude non-citizens from the base, the redistricting bases across the country. What that means is, so right now when you draw political lines, you create equal numbers of people in each district, and every state does it that way. If you change to be equal numbers of citizens or equal numbers of voters or voting age citizens, that will dramatically reallocate political power in this country and remove representation from so many people. And it has been very clear, both through the documents coming out in the lawsuits challenging the citizenship question and in some of the legislative efforts that are starting in the states, that this is a major push that we're going to see probably as early as December when bills start to be pre-filed. That's the natural next step of this. And that's something that needs to be pushed back on now.
So many of the issues that we've just brought up around the court, I know what everybody in the room is thinking. The court, the Supreme Court. Justice Kennedy just stepped down. So Congressman Nadler, can you tell us what's going on in Washington and what the Democratic Party is thinking about as it relates to appointing a new Supreme Court justice? That's an easy question, huh? See, after that nice introduction, you know, you knew I was going to give you the hard one.
It's easy to answer. It's not terribly cheerful. Is this going out over the mic?
Put it closer. That's the good mic.
Okay, it's not, well, the president can and will nominate somebody. He will nominate somebody pre-screened by the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society, two very conservative organizations. He's the first president who's ever, and you have to say, he's kept his promises. He promised during the campaign that he would give the judge-making power to these right-wing organizations and that he would select from a list, and he actually printed the list before the election, and he's adhering to it. It's a terrible list. It's a list of very right-wing judges, and some of them are very smart, very capable, very learned, and very right-wing, like Gorsuch. Now, the Senate has to confirm, and of course you know what happened with Merrick Garland, where they invented this new...
Gorsuch is a fellow Columbia College grad.
Well...
Like you, Jerry.
So is Dick Morris. The Senate, of course, McConnell and the Republicans invented the principle last year that, gee, it wouldn't be right to confirm the president's nominee when we're only 8 months from an election. Let the people vote for a new president first. So they wouldn't even give Merrick Garland a hearing. Now they've announced that they're going to confirm the president's nominee by the fall. That's what they've said. Of course, the Democrats are saying, well, the principle should hold. We're only 4 months away from an election. The Senate's up for re-election. They're not going to do it. There are very few tools with which the minority party in the Senate can oppose the nomination. It used to be you could filibuster a nomination. The rules were changed. The Democrats, when they were in power, changed the rules on lower court nominees because the Republicans were blocking all of Obama's. The Republicans now changed the rules for the Supreme Court nominees. So it's a simple majority vote. There are ways of delaying it by a few days, but not much more than that. So if the hope is that you can, if you nominate someone terrible, which I presume will be the case, that you can peel off, well, the Senate is 51-49. 51 Republicans, 49 Democrats. Actually, 47 Democrats and 2 who caucus with the Democrats, Bernie Sanders and Angie King. 51-49. Senator McCain is ill and probably won't vote. That means they have 50 votes. With 50 votes, the vice president can break the tie. So you need one Republican vote to split off, assuming you hold every Democrat. Now, there are at least 2 Republican senators, Murkowski of Alaska, Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who are pro-choice. They say they're pro-choice. The president has sworn that he will not consider anyone who is not anti-choice. So we can be assured that whoever he nominates would be a vote against to overturn Roe v. Wade, and would be the decisive vote. And they might, by the way, not overturn Roe v. Wade. You simply distinguish it and reduce it to insignificance without formally overturning it. You can do that. Can you get Senator Collins or Senator Murkowski to vote against a nominee based on that? That's a slim reed to lean on. Senator Collins announced yesterday publicly that, well, the Senate was wrong not to give Merrick Garland a hearing. The president deserves a hearing. The Senate should give a hearing to his nominee, and we should give a hearing to President Trump's nominee. That doesn't lead us to hope much, but maybe she'll vote the other way. But then you have another problem. There are 3 or 4 Senate Democrats who are in very Republican states, and they might feel impelled for political survival. They're up for re-election to vote that way, to vote for the nominee. So we can try to oppose the nominee in every way possible. I'm not terribly optimistic. I will say one other thing, just about the politics of it. Congress hangs in the balance. Certainly the House does, maybe the Senate. One of the things that will determine, probably the key thing that will determine control of the House and Senate is how many people come out to vote. Who comes out to vote? Someone said, when Democrats vote, Democrats win. Yes. When Republicans vote, Republicans win. Democrats tend to vote less for a lot of sociological reasons. So the question from an electoral political point of view is, how intense are the feelings? What's the intensity? Are you likely to get a bigger Democratic percentage turnout than usual compared to a bigger Republican turnout than usual? All the evidence since Trump was elected is that the intensity on the Democratic side is very high. You see that in the special elections. You see that in state legislative elections. You see that in primary turnouts. Democratic candidates are running consistently at least 10 to 15 points ahead of where they ran in 2016 in the same district. Republicans, not so much. And if you ask Democrats, are you certain to vote in the primary, in the general election, you get a much higher yes answer than Republicans. So the Republicans, the Trump administration, they know that they must increase the Republican intensity. They have tried 2 things, and I think they're going to try a third. The first thing they're trying is, 1, say that Trump is on the ballot. You heard Steve Bannon say this. Trump is on the ballot. If the Democrats get control, we will impeach the president. So you've got to come out and vote in order to stop the impeachment. It's not Congressman McGillicuddy versus candidate McGurk. It's Trump is on the ballot. That's attempt number 1. Attempt number 2 is mobilize the base through the racism and the anti-immigrant hysteria, which is a lot of what you're seeing now. I think attempt number 3 is going to be, we got to elect a Republican Congress, or Republican Senate, because of the judges. We got to elect Republican judges. If the Republican nominee is confirmed before the election, if he's confirmed and confirmed before the election, that'll be somewhat weaker. If it's still outstanding at the election, that'll be a motivating force for Republican voters. And that's just a background fact here.
Okay.
And just in the last sentence, bottom line is, you got to have the votes. And I don't know that we have the votes now. Hopefully we'll change that.
I promised we would save enough time for questions, and so I'm saving my one more question for the end, and I want to open it up. I implore everyone who raises their hand to please ask a question. A question ends with a question mark. So therefore, it's not a statement we're looking for because there's a lot of people who want to talk. So what I'm going to do is take 3 at a time, then I'll let our panelists respond, and then we'll continue and take more because I think that will work very well. So why don't we go back here? 1, 2, 3. And please identify yourself because it is a conversation.
Is this on? No. My name is Dr. Harvey Heschel. I'm not a member of this congregation. I'm not a member of this congregation. I have a question where we can do something, but we choose not to do something. Make theoretical discussions, but cannot do anything. The state Senate of New York hangs in the balance. A Jewish senator in State Senate 17 in Brooklyn is giving control, a Democratic Jewish state senator is giving control of the State Senate of New York to the Republican Party. Why are the people around here not having a mass effort in both money and volunteers to make sure he loses the Democratic primary? Simcha felt we can do something about it.
Take 3. Okay, pass the mic.
Hi, I'm Catherine Klein, and I live 2 blocks from here. And I have a simple question and quick follow-up, depending on the answer. Are we allowed not to respond to the question about whether we're citizens or not? And if the answer is legally we're not, why don't we organize? None of us should answer that question.
Mr. Nadler,
Closer, hold the mic closer.
Better?
Yes.
You recited a number of issues that I think most of us in this room probably know about. Our president has a bully pulpit and Twitter. He has a way to go to his base. What does the Democratic Congress and Senate have to talk to its base so that you're not just talking to this small room? Why isn't it that every day someone from the Senate and someone from the House of Representatives isn't on the news? Open a Twitter account. Get to the base.
Thank you. Those are 3 excellent questions. Why don't we just start with the Simcha Felder question, and I'll let Congressman Nadler
I'll
take
answer
that.
the Simcha Felder question very, very succinctly. Simcha Felder is the senator from Borough Park. He is technically a Democrat. Last year, he was elected on the Democratic and Republican lines. There is a primary candidate against him this year. The odds of that candidate winning are slim, but it hardly matters. Simcha will get reelected on the Republican line if he doesn't win the Democratic line. And the answer to the state Senate is forget about Simcha Felder, elect some Democratic senators. And we can do that. And in a number of the cases where we have toss-up districts for Congress, in the same areas we have toss-up districts for the state Senate. We had for a while a real problem with something called the Independent Democratic Conference, a rogue group of 8 senators who caucused with the Republicans. They are back now. They are now part of the caucus. How trustworthy that is remains to be seen. There are primaries against some of them. I'm supporting a candidate against one of them in part of this neighborhood. But they are back together for the moment under pressure from the governor. Simcha Felder is not, he is part of the problem, but he's not a soluble part of the problem. The other electing a couple more Democratic state senators is a real solution.
Wendy, why don't you take the census question?
Technically, you are required to answer all the questions on the census. It's not that it doesn't count, it's that you would be violating the law as it relates to the census. You're required to respond to the census, including all the sentences. So yes, it would count. I believe it would count. But yes. As a lawyer, I would encourage people. I would not encourage people to violate the law.
Well,
You're not supposed to lie on the census form
right.
either.
So I'm not a lawyer, and it sounds to me like a very interesting idea to boycott that one question on the census and everybody leave it out. I think that's fascinating, I have to say. This is a first really interesting thing I've heard about a political action around the census in a long time.
But I would say that one other thing that we can organize is to get everybody counted here in New York, which takes a lot of legwork and is something that folks can volunteer on, and that could make also a very big difference. So I would also
don't
recommend
boycott the census. We need everybody counted. We lose tremendous amount of money if we don't. Jerry, could you take the question on why you guys are not tweeting?
We guys are tweeting. The president, obviously, any president has the bully pulpit. The minority party, that is the party that doesn't have the president, is always at a communications disadvantage because he's got the bully pulpit and the press covers him more than anything. When you have a majority in one of the houses of Congress, the majority leader or the speaker gets covered more. When you have the minorities, they get covered less. We have a very systematic program of social media, of tweets. We have contests every couple of months as to who among the Democratic members got their friends list or whatever you call tweets, the highest, the highest. There's an active program. The Democratic minority in each committee has a special person in charge of that. We're all doing social media, and we're getting as much publicity as we can. But you're always at a disadvantage, and I think we're getting a fair amount these days on what we're doing. But you're always at a disadvantage with the president.
Other
Any
questions?
president.
Why don't we take 1, 2, 3? Then I'll
Let me
look
add
at
just
this
one
side.
thing to that.
Yeah.
You got to remember something else. The minority party, that is to say the party without the president, is going to concentrate its communications resources in districts where it really matters. We're not going to, the Democratic Party is not going to spend a lot of money in this district. This is a safe Democratic district. I might have a primary, but I'm not going to have a general election challenge that's meaningful. But so you're not going to see here a lot of the kind of advertising communications that you would in a lot of other parts of the country.
So I just, first of all, thank you so much for your work, your efforts. I see it every day on Twitter, and it's awesome. My question is, how is the Democratic Party going to reach younger voters who are feeling right now, I have notes here from the younger voters that I work with, overwhelmed, numb, quote, everything is so fucked up. I can't engage because everything is, it's hopeless, it's helpless. I don't feel as though I can be engaged in a political system where a sociopathic individual is being supported and treated as though, this is real politics. And these are quotes, not what I'm saying. So you have all these people feeling this incredible sense of numbness, ennui, overwhelmed, I can't handle it. And you have a president who speaks in this kind of fiery, jazzy language, which is in itself hugely problematic.
It's a great question.
How do we speak to these people and
Right.
say, hope, change, yes,
Okay.
we can.
It's a great question. 2 more questions. I think we picked 2 more people back here, and then we'll go to the other side for the next round.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Rheingold. I'm a member of Congregation Road of Shalom, and I live around the corner. I'm wondering if one of you can explain, I was looking at the advisory commission that's going to redraw districts in 2021, and I don't really, maybe I understand it. I'm a lawyer, so I should understand it, but of course, it's a little gobbledygook. It looks a little political to me. And in general, not surprising, I want to recommend to everybody, I think it was 538, did a special a series on different states' efforts at different varieties of redistricting commissions. Arizona's effort, California's effort, North Carolina's effort, very informative. But this looks like politicians pick, and then the last 2 are supposed to be people who are not political. Do I have that right? It says there are first the majority and minority leaders. Anyway, I don't.
Okay,
You
so
know what it
it's
says.
a good
I'm wondering if you can
question.
explain it.
Good question. One more question. Back there, yeah.
Hi, my name is Paula Weiss, and I'm a member of B'nai Jeshurun, and I live in Riverdale, actually. I would like your help in understanding, based on the way you each laid out the issues leading up to the Q&A, who checks the president in this environment? And what I mean is, are we literally looking at a man who can, democratically and not so democratically, appoint himself a leader for life? Because that's the part I'm trying to sit here and breathe, and I can't breathe because it feels like our system actually is allowing this to happen.
Thank you. So we have three very important questions here, and I'll let you both decide which ones you want to answer about the young voters,
I think
the
I have to answer the first
Redistricting
one.
Commission, and who checks the president.
On the young voters, it's a very good question. I wish we had a very good answer. It's a perennial question. The country as a whole, has been very unsuccessful in getting young voters for decades. The young voters participated at a much smaller rate for a lot of reasons. Now there's a tremendous cynicism, as you said. The only answer is you try to show the difference. And sometimes you get a candidate, look at this candidate who just won, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She mobilized a lot of young voters. She mobilized a lot of Hispanic voters on an ethnic
Primarily
basis.
young voters.
But she, what?
Primarily young voters.
Well, I don't know that. But among the non-Hispanic voters, they were primarily young voters who voted for her. You have to go out and do the legwork, and you have to convince people. And there's no substitute frankly, for, and social media, which people read and look at. But if people are going to just be cynical and say, there's nothing I can do, I don't know how you penetrate that, other than by showing that you can do something.
I wanted to just add a little something to that. I think that voting isn't the only goal of engagement, and we are seeing a real flowering of engagement of young people across the country, especially leading out of Parkland, which I think studies show that kind of engagement leads to more civic engagement, including voting. And I think encouraging participation in whatever issues you care about is one way to get people. I will say that actually influencing who is ultimately elected is part of what matters, but actually just being counted and being counted as somebody who voted actually is an exercise of political power that has consequences. And I had a story that I had told someone earlier about a community of Haitians in Miami that I represented, challenging a law that made it impossible for people to engage in voter registration drives. And their story was they had been trying for years to get a bus route in their community. They had really difficult long commutes and they couldn't get one. And they organized a voter registration drive and dropped 6,000 voter registrations on the mayor's decks. And the next week they had a bus line. And they did not change who was elected, but they showed that they count and they're participating and they're organizing. So and people respond to that, and politicians respond to that, and it's actually even seeing that people are willing to get off their bottoms and do something and engage is an important message that changes the political infrastructure in a lot of ways and what is possible.
I just want to add to that 2 seconds of commentary, which is to the extent that anyone feels that government is responsive to them. And this is why engagement in local elections is so important, because that creates the citizens who will do more afterwards. That's where you can see on the ground the kinds of story that Wendy just told. So part of our problem now is that we have this extraordinary low turnout in city elections, and that's actually depressing turnout in the national elections as well, and it's having this negative interaction effect. So I think part of what we have to do as older people and as voters is start connecting more directly our younger friends to the political process exactly through that kind of activity. What do you want from government that you're not getting? Let's work on that and figure that out. Whether it's through a 311 call where you have a community problem and you can sort of demonstrate to a young person that if you involve yourself that way, you actually can get a response. And, you know, on the bigger issues, you need to organize your friends and vote. I think this disconnection comes from looking up and saying, it doesn't matter what I do, they don't hear me anyway. Well, at the local level, they can hear you, and we can get that translated and change the ennui and change the alienation. I've seen that happen, and there's research that supports that. If you can connect people at the local level, we can get them to focus on the national.
Let me add just one thing on that. When I was first getting involved in politics, it was the era of the Vietnam War. We were all opposed to it. And a lot of young people who were opposed to the Vietnam War joined local Democratic clubs. And the Democratic clubs were vibrant, and they had a major impact on policy and who got elected, and they were influenced by these people. Today, the political infrastructure is a shadow of what it once was. 5 kids could probably take over any Democratic club in half the city if they wanted to. The average age of the members of the clubs is high these days. And those institutions exist. They have a close connection with the public officials, and they're ripe, I mean, for any kind of civic engagement by anybody who's interested and willing to devote a little time and effort. Period. It's much easier than it was in those days because they're much smaller and weaker. And I say that about the Democratic clubs. The Republican clubs don't even exist anymore. On the question about the Redistricting Commission, it is pretty much a very weak Redistricting Commission. I don't remember the exact makeup of it, but it's heavily influenced by the legislative leaders in both the Senate and the Assembly. And when the commission comes up with a legislative plan, with a redistricting plan, it submits it to the legislature. The legislature can say yes or no. If it says no, it goes back to the commission. The commission comes up with a second plan. If the legislature says no a second time, then the commission goes away and the legislature can do what it wants. That's the system. It is, I suppose, a little improvement over the old system, but it's still very heavily political. I will have one historical note. When I was in college, I was an intern at the 1967 State Constitutional Convention, which proposed a new state constitution, part of which was an excellent independent redistricting commission. Unfortunately, the voters, for other reasons, voted down the Constitution. But we missed that opportunity quite a few years ago. But we could, you don't have initiative and referendum statewide, so you can't force it onto the ballot as you can in California. You've got to get the legislature to propose a decent redistricting commission to establish it, or to propose it as a constitutional amendment, in which case the voters would have to approve it.
All the good government groups in New York have been supporting it, whether it's Common Cause or Citizens Union, and if you really care about that, you should engage with those groups because there's tremendous efforts being made to get the legislature to pass it. The third question was on who checks the president. I'll ask Wendy to start on that if she doesn't mind. You're going to punt it back to the congressman.
Obviously, our biggest check on the president is our Congress and our oversight bodies and committees that haven't been currently functioning as effectively as we would like. There are other weaker checks on the president, and one that is worth thinking through also as we're going through this judicial nomination process are the courts as well, and whether or not the courts will allow the current checks to be applied to the president will depend on interpretations going down the pike, so I think that that's worth thinking about as well. But elections have consequences on how much of check function will happen in Congress, and I'll punt with that.
Well, it's Congress is the major check on the president. The system of checks and balances is three governmental bodies: the courts, the presidency, and the Congress are supposed to check and balance each other. But when you have a partisan lineup with a party that's unwilling to check the president, which we have now, then there's very little check. I made a speech this morning, and we had a hearing this morning where the head of the FBI and the Deputy Attorney General were in front of the Judiciary Committee to be grilled about why they didn't do the right thing on Hillary's emails, and essentially. That's what we're spending our time on. And I made a speech, my opening speech was, why aren't we having oversight on this for the president? You know, within the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee, we have these families being torn apart at the border. That's an emergency. We have babies who we don't know if they're getting back to their families. That's an emergency. We have all kinds of things, listed a whole bunch of things that we should be, the president's violating the Emoluments Clause. Nothing's being done. That's an emergency. Whole bunch of things. And said, and what we have to waste our time on is Hillary's emails, which is a little passé. But the fact is that currently the Republicans are in control, don't want to do any basic oversight. You will get real oversight, and that's one of the reasons the administration is terrified. If the Democrats take control, then every committee will be doing oversight on various different things, and some people will judge that we're wasting our time on this or that, but a lot of it will be very important. But it's up to the voters to give it. And let me say one other thing. At the Constitutional Convention,
You get one other thing.
At the Constitutional Convention, when they were discussing the pardon power, and the president has a very broad pardon power, and some delegates said, well, maybe with this pardon power we're designing is too broad. And James Iredell of Pennsylvania said, what if the president were to engage in a criminal conspiracy and pardoned his co-conspirators? And Madison answered, oh, that could never happen. Because if that ever happened, such a president would be instantly impeached. So they viewed the impeachment power as a limit on the pardon power, among other things, but they didn't anticipate the rise of political parties, which makes impeachments and a lot of other ways of reining in a president much more difficult. So having a Congress that is willing to do oversight and to rein in the power of the presidency by whatever means it may be called for in the situation is very important. Right now we don't have it.
Wow. 3 more questions. Let's just 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. My name is Jennifer Marr. I'm not a member of the congregation, but I am an Upper West Sider. And I think most importantly, for the purposes of this question, I'm a millennial voter. So the question the question that's been brought up here is, how do you get younger people out to
Drop
vote?
the mean age in the room by 25 years by coming.
Well, I have to say, seeing Congressman Nadler, every day fighting is inspiring. The problem is that most people my age and younger are asking is, where's the fire from everyone else? It's been difficult this week with all the horrible things that have been happening to see Representative Waters come out and speak, and suddenly Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and Bernie Sanders all come down on her. I think that's the biggest frustration, seeing Democrats attacking themselves. And I think we want to know, why are they not fighting harder? Meanwhile, today there was a 14-word release from the DHS saying, we must protect and we must secure our borders. These sort of Nazi, what are we fighting that with? Why are we trying to make nice at a time like this?
Hi, my name's Susan Hyman. I am a member and a neighbor. And I'm listening respectfully to discussions of the problems with our institutions and trying to stay within the laws, but it strikes me the other party, or the Republican Party, is not trying to stay within the laws. And the paradigm has shifted. You said social media has changed the way things happen. President Obama made that work for him, but the Democrats have not made that work for them since then. And so the question is, our democracy has changed. How do we shift with it so we're not left out of it? And how do we save that democracy? Because I'm not hearing that. I'm hearing we're staying within our institutions, but our institutions aren't really working. So the question is, how do we save it and move forward?
Hi, Ellen Landsberger. I'm a member here and a neighbor, and I really also want to thank you for. Oh, sorry. I really want to thank you very much for all the efforts that you've done in your leadership. We keep hearing about that the 40%, 38 to 40% are solid, and that they're not changing, but that they're also behind the Congress, the Republican congressmen and senators, and they're afraid to act out for that. Is that really true? Is there anybody on the Republican side that we can count on who really might stand up and be a profile in courage?
Thank you. I'm going to let the congressman answer. He has a hard stop at 9 o'clock, I've just learned. So we're going to end after I give our panelists the opportunities to answer. The first question is on really how are we going to find the fire?
Well,
I think that was a Springsteen song, wasn't it? Okay.
I think the fire is there, and I think you cannot judge that by reactions to Maxine Waters.
Well, I mean, that was just sort of an example, basically. Sorry.
The fire is there, but it can, and you've seen people go to the border. See members of the House and the Senate go to the border. You've seen them go to the detention facility in Elizabeth and various other places. Pramila Jayapal, I just learned, was arrested today at an ICE facility. And we do what we can within the constraints of the fact that we are not the majority. We've got to win this election. We win the election, you get control of one house, you will see things really change. And for that, you've got to have the voters motivated to do that. And I hope that when you see all the terrible things from Trump, voters will be motivated. And the one thing, let me just say, it's perfectly kosher and okay to criticize Democrats, for not doing enough and so forth, but keep your eye on the ball. We've got to defeat Republicans and elect people and not just have internecine frustration fire, because that doesn't help. The second question was?
I think the question that both of you can address, and then we can wrap up the evening, is has democracy changed?
Democracy has changed in two ways, I think. Number one, I don't have time to go into this, but read Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann. The Republican Party has gone off the rails. You normally have two political parties, a center-left party, a center-right party. Maybe the center-left party goes a little further left, but they function as political parties. They agree to the legitimacy of the other. They know there's going to be transfers of power. They don't try to rig the game and destroy the democratic system. The Republican Party has gone off the rails and is an extremist party of a type you haven't seen in this country since before the Civil War, really. And that's a problem now. And you fix a political party, the only way political parties historically get fixed is by losing a number of elections, and then things change. And hopefully we can arrange that. The second way that this has changed is technology. FDR became a master of using the radio. So did Adolf Hitler. They used it to different effects, but they were masters at it. And both used it when other politicians weren't able to or hadn't discovered how to. John Kennedy really was the first to use television effectively, and now we have all the social media, and people are learning to use it, and some will be more effective than others. The House Democratic Party as a whole office trying to figure out how to do it most effectively, and maybe we do a good job, maybe we don't, but we're trying to adapt the new technology to the political process. And that's how democracy has changed, really. Other than that, the process remains fundamentally the same. You got to elect people. The technology of elections, the technology of communications changes, but it fundamentally comes down to motivating people, getting them out to vote.
Wendy.
I will end with that as well. I think we're at an inflection point, and we're at a point where things could get really much worse in terms of the functioning of our systems. And the only way, this isn't so much working within the systems, it's mobilizing as citizens, voting and stepping up and taking back our republic and making sure that the rules are fair again and that it works well again. And it's 2018. We're in an election year. This is a time when you can actually try to right that ship. You write it here in New York, but you can work to write it everywhere else in the country as well. We all need to mobilize if this is going to be fixed. We're not just relying on the people in our institutions. They can't do it without us.
Thank you. Before I call Larissa back up, I really want to thank Congressman Nadler and Wendy Weiser for an extraordinary, informative evening. And I know you have to leave, Congressman. I'm going to call up Larissa from BJ, who is actually going to provide for us some opportunities to engage. Thank you all.
Thank you again. So again, Senator Aberson is in the back with Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and they are doing active canvassing around an issue that is important to a lot of our own community members and to a lot of members in New York around the caring majority and aging. So if that is an issue that you care deeply about, that is one way really to get out the vote and to engage people and make sure they go to the polls with that issue in mind. We're also going to be sending up some follow-up information early next week. We have to collect some things, but we're going to be sending out over the course of the summer. We're looking to do some voter registration as well as some engagement around families and what families with younger kids or teens can do to affect the voter turnout in this election. So there are opportunities to engage, particularly this summer. I know it's sometimes a time when folks go out of town, but we also understand that people are around and really looking to do something. So as we find out more information about what's available, we're going to make sure all of you know that. Again, thank you so much for coming out tonight, and we'll be in touch.